Well, welcome to Business Talk, your home of distinctive insights on the web, and time to talk bank regulation. Now, it's hardly the stuff that's likely to grab headlines in a country where we've got blue light protection rackets assaulting citizens, the NHI causing the collective blood pressures to rise dangerously, and where on any given day one has to contend without power or water. But just as the European Union has finished putting the finishing touches on its acceptance of the Basel III requirements, talk is now shifting towards possible capital requirements for fossil fuel funding. And this has serious ramifications for South African banks if it's adopted under the Basel Accords or any accords to which we are signatories. Now, I'm really thrilled to have David Buckham, CEO at Monocle Solutions, back with us to talk about this beyond banking. Great to chat to you again, David. Always good.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, we really enjoyed your session that you moderated last Wednesday at the GIBS Monocle Beyond Banking Conference, which I thought was a great day of, interacting with some very senior bankers on very pertinent issues of our time.
We had a lot of fun, I think, at that Beyond Banking Conference at GIBS. And, throughout the course of the day, what really struck me is the mix that you had in the room from CEOs. We were on a panel with ABSA CEO Ari Rautenbach, the CEO of Standard Bank, Margaret Ninaba. We had chaps from the FIC, we had the regulators, we had the fintechs in the room. There really was a broad mix. What is your vision for this kind of event? Because from my perspective, where I sit, it's very unique in the banking calendar to have a mixed event. I mean, we've got the bosses of this world, and it seems to be just the banks speaking to themselves. What's your vision for this event?
So, yes, I think, Michael, exactly to your point, is that there's an absence or a gap in the market as it pertains to providing a platform in which people are not selling product or merely repeating a marketing-approved position and in which they're having a real conversation. Now, in Europe, there's the European Risk Management Council, which is by invitation only, and which is a Chatham House event rules, which is a small, limited number of people that sit around a table at C-suite level with some sponsorship, but no sales. But I found it a bit small and too much in camera. So the idea was to go to an authentic educator that has got gravitas in the market, associate our brand with that gravitas, help select one day of intense conversation with the right people and fill the room, but make sure that the room is limited to 200 people. So the vision for the future would be that as we go forward, and we do have a first right of refusal, and I can guarantee you that we'll, take up that right going forward, which is to create a day in which C-level bankers discuss the most pertinent issues of our time in a way that's not just purely scripted out of their marketing scripts. And I think that's what we had where in some of the interactions between Ari and myself, and certainly the meeting with the FIC and the FCA, FCSA, it was a sense of honesty, and you heard some of the nervous laughter when people asked me and various other panelists what needs to be done to end the grey listing. And I think if you take issues such as the energy crisis in South Africa, the arrogance of the global north, the climate change narrative, the necessity to adopt European legislation, but that's not necessarily in our favor, the hypocrisy from Europe, and also the sheer fact that the banks are making profits that are multiple times greater than the economic growth in South Africa, and how is that possible? And to have those conversations in an open forum, and we received very positive feedback, actually, Michael.
I was just saying, I was chatting to one of the delegates from Investec, I think, and he said, Michael, it's so refreshing. We often come to these conferences and everything feels like the panels have been scripted and practiced well in advance. Everyone knows exactly what they're going to say. And this just felt like you got the mix right. People were speaking frankly, candidly. And I also think you've got the timing of this right, because I think many in South Africa, in the public and the private sectors, realize that the time to talk platitudes and beyond each other is over. We really have to park the political correct speech to one side and say, what are we going to do to address the challenges of this country? Because the July riots of last year are just still too fresh in everyone's memory, as a stark reminder of what's at play here. I think a big issue, let's just move on to, and you mentioned the Financial Intelligence Centre was there, the FSCA, and I found their contributions were also really refreshing. There did seem to be a sense, potentially among some of the bankers, though, that everything's good, we're talking to each other, and so we're going to get off the grey list. You added a bit more of a sober view, shall we say. What needs to be done to ensure we're removed in 24 months' time, and how likely is it?
Michael, contemplating this question is kind of like contemplating one's response to a kind of apocalyptic existential event that's impending and that you can see on the horizon like a massive tidal wave. The truth is that the place that we're lacking is in prosecuting crimes. Not that we are not finding the crimes, we're finding the crimes, but in prosecuting the criminals. Now, those criminals are often the same criminals that we speak about in the newspapers and in Daily Maverick or in Business Tech. These are crimes that we know that are happening in state organizations or in corporate organizations, and we can see the cash flows, and we can see the accounts in the banks. So the question is not, are the banks capable of monitoring it and tracking down these crimes? And the question is not, are we able to even prosecute? The question is, are we able to put people behind bars? And there's a long recent history in South Africa of backpedaling, slow pedaling. I often think of that game we played at school, like in the pool, see who could stay in the same place, in deep water as long as possible. And the reality is that if we do not have effective prosecutions, people behind bars in 24 months, that we cannot paper that over. And I'd like to point out, Michael, that there's an assumption made in South African banking that it will all be okay. And I want to remind people that when we lost our status in the Commonwealth to easily get visas to Australia, New Zealand, and to the United Kingdom to get the 2 years' work, I always make this analogy with passports. The difficulty of getting a Schengen visa or a British visa or a US visa has become infinitely more difficult because of the lack of rigidity and international standards that we stick to. So it would require very simply massive political willpower, and I'm not seeing that massive political willpower yet on other issues, such as, for example, the energy crisis. And I know we like to use the CEO of Nedbank's analogy about passing the baton on, which is useful to understand that who's responsible right now. But I do believe that it will take the highest levels of leadership in this country to realize the dire implications of being put outside of the kraal, so to speak, of international finance and what impact that will have on funding. And I hope if those people understand that they could speed the process up. I believe that the roadblocks are in the way because it's not convenient and it's not understood. So for me, what would need to happen we'd need to have an emergency meeting with the most senior political leaders in this country and logically take them through the implications of continuing along this path of backpack. I can't put it in a more prosaic way.
Well, the reality is there for all to see, even if you're not intimately familiar with the inner workings of the FATF and what they're looking for. We're not seeing the prosecutions. You've got to ask the reason. And the question is why are we not seeing prosecutions? Well, you follow the money. Who does it suit to have a system that fails to prosecute what is very obvious and easily identifiable white-collar crime and financial flows? And it's just a cumulative effect. What worries me, David, is it's now... people forget we fell out of the World Government Bond Index, the WGBI. We had our credit rating downgraded to junk. We're now on the FATF grey list. The exclusion from certain Commonwealth privileges that we used to hold, as you mentioned, for ease of travel. All of these things weigh on the ability for an economy to be competitive, to be dynamic, and for business people to go about conducting business and creating economic growth. And I think, many in the political sphere, I've got to say, just don't understand this. And this brings us to the other interesting theme that we touched on, and it's sustainable finance. And you recently returned from a global conference in Europe, I think, where the talk is of adding punitive capital charges to banks who fund fossil fuels. Now, could you imagine if we introduced this here, given the carbon intensity of our economy? What exactly was discussed?
So we were in a conference which follows Chatham House rules. So the idea was that you have C-level people that meet at literally, a step away from the Houses of Parliament in a very fancy building, which is the Old National Liberal Club. And you then discuss these matters, and C-level people attend, but you can't describe any statement to any person, and there's no media. And no recordings of the event. So I'm able to convey to you the sentiment and the argument. And I was running the session that was the last quarter of the day. You kind of have 4 issues of the day. Global politics and the Ukrainian invasion was the first one. And if I could just go back to the point that we were just making, if we're about to host the BRICS conference and Vladimir Putin visits South Africa, that doesn't go unnoticed by the Americans. And the American dollar is the reserve currency, and FATF is a European initiative that's very closely aligned to American policy. So our movement towards a kind of multipolar alignment of an African/Indian currency exchange is also not helping our cause if we want to get off the grey list. So politically, we're misaligned at the moment if we want to get off the grey list and be part of the unipolar dollar reserve system. If you look at the conference, it goes like this. Certain people whose self-interest is in selling green bonds and promoting the kind of Malthusian climate change narrative. And I can see where the Malthusian element comes in, which is to say that the end is nigh. It snowed in Joburg. We've had 3 of the hottest days in the year worldwide. There's a kind of parabolic trend. The ice is melting. The world is ending. There's a storm in Brazil. Sometimes I feel like the narrative is so overwhelming that any weather event now gets ascribed to climate change, which may or may not be true. Climate change plus El Nino, the 7-year cycle. Our narrative has become quite unscientific compared to what it should be, given the important nature of the balance that needs to take place between energy security and, preventing the ravages of climate change. So this is the kind of argument that's happening, which is that any bank that's funding fossil fuel should pay a punitive capital charge, and that capital charge should run through the different risk types like credit risk or market risk or operational risk. Because, for example, credit risk, if you're funding fossil fuel expansion, you could blame the Pakistan floods almost in a circuitous, indirect way on BP, and BP was funded, let's say, for example, by Barclays Bank, and therefore Barclays Bank should pay a capital charge which may or may not go to the loss and recovery fund, which has been promoted by the Global South at COP28. So the capital charge is punitive. It's supposed to dissuade banks from funding fossil fuel and old technology. And there's several dire implications which I argued against, which is, for example, number one, we don't live in a world where you can just switch off the coal generators. If we did live in that world, they would have already been switched off. It's A, not possible to switch them off without Europe freezing to death. B, it's not possible to switch them off without us becoming, for example, a country that cannot produce any economic output at all, because we're 80% dependent on carbon. C, it's not economically viable to do so because the cost per unit of energy in many locations is far higher when using renewable energy. Fourth, it doesn't take into account the true cost of renewable energy. So, for example, 90% of the world's solar panels, voltaic solar panels, are made in China, which means that iron ore has to be dug out of the ground in Australia. Australia has to send that iron ore at a cost to China, which transports it to a factory which makes steel, then adds the voltaic batteries, which are also imported parts, and then put it on a ship which runs on diesel and sells it around the world. So if we take in the full life cycle of creating a solar panel, it's very different to just taking the renewable nature of the solar panel when it's being used. We also don't take into account the true cost of getting rid of the solar panel, and what are we going to do with all the wasted voltaic batteries and the lithium batteries, because that's quite a complicated problem, scientific problem. But also we don't take account of the fact that we're supporting a totalitarian regime, and we're further disrupting the project of liberal democracy. So, and we're not taking account also of the veracity of the information. Are we really, is China really moving towards a carbon zero carbon footprint? And, Michael, a great example of this is the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. Here is a country who 99.99999% of their income depends on fossil fuels, and they're hosting carbon zero, net zero conferences. And they're going to build a $500 billion carbon zero city. So I personally think that it's to place a capital charge on banks at this stage without taking the full range of problems into account is to paper over a major world problem and to create an expense that's simply going to be placed on the consumer. And
one
for that
point,
matter, on the West,
David, and just on that point, and excuse me for interjecting, but I think advocates of the proposal often claim or couch or frame the proposal in the sense of reducing risk, because their concern is that, if banks just continue to lend into these fossil fuel entities, they potentially, with the speed and pace of innovation in the energy sector and transformation and shift to renewables, might be ended up with these assets that are not worth very much, stranded assets as they call them, on the balance sheet, and that may trigger a new financial crisis. I had my doubts about that because I haven't seen any energy revolution that has, in human history, done away with these previous sources of energy and replaced them just with one new source. And that's what we're proposing to do effectively, do away with oil, coal, gas, and potentially even nuclear, and just replace it with renewables. I don't know if that's even possible given the minerals that will be required that you just mentioned. But do you see that as a specious argument? Do you think that the risk of stranded assets leading to a new financial crisis, is that a risk at all to you?
No, I mean, I think that there's a major narrative, a kind of overwhelming narrative, which is that the that the end is nigh. Like by 2030, this has to be achieved, otherwise we're finished. We pass a point of no return. So the language and the linguistics of the argument are very harassing and are very apocalyptic. So that then translates into, we urgently need to create policy, and we must align with government, and we must align with sentiment. So you see it articulated in three different ways. The one is you get a kind of cognitive dissonance in the marketing speech, which is net profit and net zero, and we can do both at the same time. We just need the right talent. Or you can see the kind of green, the green washing that you see in the way that banks are promoting their agenda, and they're doing so for marketing reasons, to have customers feel better about themselves. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that they articulate this problem in terms of technical language, like the capital charge. So most average people don't know what a capital charge is, and they don't understand that the capital charge is on top of already very heavy capital charges that have made banking since the 2008 financial crisis not less risky, but more risky. Right in the teeth of the crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, right after that crisis, the solution was, according to regulators, to not solve the problem of how to stop banks creating fancy financial instruments that lead to these bubbles, but to impose much more capital charge on banks. So banks should now hold more quality of a higher capital. So you're asking the market of banking to go and find more capital of a higher quality at the precise time that banking is on its knees, and bank stocks are very cheap. So then you're going to attract investors like the Qatari investment fund or the Saudi Arabian investment fund, who are buying shares in Deutsche Bank and in Credit Suisse at very low prices, and are being advised to do so because banking is a high-yielding asset and will have good dividends, etc. But you change the quality of the makeup of investors in a world that's becoming politically polarized. And that's why Credit Suisse
huge risk.
Because huge risk, investor risk, which is a risk that's not captured. Now you got one bank in Switzerland, not two, which is also risky. Then going back to your question, which is the capital charge has got to be based on some kind of calculation. So if you lend to a fossil fuel, project, you're going to be punitively charged. But banks are not stupid. I mean, they'll create special purpose vehicles. They'll create green bonds to offset. They'll buy green bonds from green bond companies that certify green bonds. So you create an entire cottage industry of folk that change the names of green bonds and change the names of things so that they appear more green. And then you create a cottage industry of risk managers who set these things off on large balance sheet. You haven't actually addressed the problem. You haven't come around the table to say, here is how we're going to solve the issue together as business and government. You haven't necessarily advocated for a wind farm. And in Europe, you've got NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, which is the reason there are fewer wind farms is because they're unsightly to many Germans. I'm not picking on Germans. And then you get the final problem, which is that, in highly developed countries, they wish to impose these same capital charges and these same rules and these same targets on countries like ours, which can barely dig enough coal out the ground to run our generators. So it's like the hypocrisy of the global north towards the global south. We, came away from the COPs, the last three COPs, that's the Conference of Parties, with a measly promise of $8.5 billion loan, not gift, which is going to be given to us at some point in the very distant future I'm sure you saw Cyril Ramaphosa go begging cap in hand at the last COP for the $8.5 billion loan that was promised at the previous COP. So an entire year went by where our president had to go and ask for this promise to be met. So it's my personal view that the largest emitters, which are countries, should come together to reduce their emissions. Now, one of the largest emitters, well, in fact, the largest emitter on Earth is China. And China's emissions by far constitute the largest on Earth. But they classify themselves
but China
under the
plays
UN.
both sides. Exactly. Yeah.
100%. They classify and insist on being classified as a developing nation, and therefore are not under the same set of rules as a developed nation, such as the US. This leads to Joe Biden putting in place probably the most anti-global, anti-trade legislation in the history of mankind, called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is basically a whole lot of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars of incentives to create renewable energy projects in America rather than in Europe, and disincentives from importing from Europe. So now Europe and America are essentially in a renewable energy trade war under the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's my argument that simply placing a capital charge on banks is to oversimplify the problem. You're also going to negate any of the nuance of the problem, and you're going to have a series of basically regulatory arbitrage structures be put in place, such as SPVs in foreign locations, that are really for continued investment in fossil fuel, but not necessarily useful at solving the problem of climate change. So this is what I argued very strongly, and there was a lot of pushback, I can tell you. My prediction would be that this is...
Well, I was going to ask you, because given the complexity you just sketched out, given the risk, the potential for now regulatory arbitrage, the creation of new cottage industries, and we've seen this all happen before, and the eventual ineffectiveness of this, but the huge risk to the banking sector, how likely is it that this is adopted? Because I see it's likely to gain support in the European Parliament negotiations, but you've now got EU member states and the European Commission still negotiating, and that requires further discussion. Do you actually see this coming down the line?
The sentiment a year ago in April at this council meeting was, it's coming. It's not a question of if, but more where, and how much will the capital charge be. And it was very much impossible at that time. And you'll remember there was that one gentleman who was in charge of renewable energy from one of the banks who said a few silly things, and he got fired very quickly. I don't know if you remember that event. Is that if you don't toe the line, you're going to be eviscerated or eliminated quite quickly. So
calling out ESG for the marketing gump it's become.
Yeah. If you say the wrong thing, or if you, and to be quite honest with you, I did think that some of the things he said was quite thick. I'm not sure he should have got fired for it. Certainly the tone on the climate change narrative is extremely intolerant. The idea at these COPs is to shout very loud. Like COP28 was all about loss and damage, the Pakistan floods, the global south demanding reparations, billions of dollars of reparations. That was the main topic, not necessarily cooling down the planet. So I would say I'm 95% confident that we will see a capital charge come onto South African shores into our legislation in the next 3 years. I would have said 2 years, except that we seem to be pivoting away from the unipolar world as a country, which is constituted by US and Europe, in recent discussions about, for example, currency alignment. So I'm hoping actually that the central bank in South Africa does follow the rules and pushes back very hard while doing so against the climate capital charge. I would like to make one more very fundamental point, Michael, is that there's a great misunderstanding about the impact of capital charges. When they increase the capital charge from 8% of risk-weighted assets to a more risk-sensitive scenario in Basel, between Basel I and Basel II, which was promulgated in 2007. And when they later then, after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, created Basel III or Basel II plus and then Basel III, in which the quality and quantity of capital would be greater, the total capital required and investment required ran into the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars at the very time when bank stocks were on their knees. Apparently to make stronger capital cushions for the banking system, and therefore, in theory, to be able to absorb greater capital losses that would be constituted by loan losses and by market events and market losses and operating losses. So, for example, a cyber attack or a huge loan loss or some kind of malfunction or some kind of operating loss, like an enormous fraud. But if you look at the reality is that by increasing en masse the capital adequacy thresholds that all banks in the world had to meet, they actually inadvertently increased the riskiness of one or two or three or four banks not being able to meet this more difficult threshold. So you could argue, and it has been argued, that inadvertently they increased the risk in the system because it makes it more likely that certain banks can't meet these capital adequacy requirements. And in so doing, you'll get market events or banking failures that are more likely to occur. You see the logic, because they made it more difficult to meet.
Absolutely. And as we know, banks are ultimately all about trust, David. And so as a regulator, you should be trying to minimize the potential of such events. A very, very interesting conversation.
Since the 2008 financial crisis, there have not been fewer financial failures of banks. There have been more. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily in a single year or per year, but the last 3 or 4 failures of banks have not been because of a loss that's been incurred on the income statement that cannot be absorbed by capital. SVB did not occur because they didn't have sufficient capital. SVB occurred because of a failure of trust, and depositors wanted to withdraw their money, and in order to create the money to allow the depositors to withdraw their money, they had to sell government bonds, which incurred a loss of $1.8 billion. And when they announced that loss, which by the way is far smaller than the amount that depositors were wanting to withdraw, suddenly all depositors want to withdraw all their money, and then the FDIC, Deposit Insurance Corporation, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, had to step in and guarantee all those depositors, which immediately caused sudden death in the bank. People forget that the reason banks fail, we're actually writing a book on this at the moment called Why Banks Fail. The reason banks fail is not because they steadily incur losses that cannot be absorbed by their capital. They fail because they have a sudden death event on their liquidity side.
Yeah, and in a world that's digital, there's no queues in a bank run. You could instantly withdraw your capital, and so when that instant moment happens where trust is severed, a bank can collapse almost immediately. And as SVB, and as I think Kuben Naidu, the deputy governor of the SARB, said, I think quite eloquently in his keynote address at the Beyond Banking conference as well. David, sadly, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but fascinating chatting to you about these capital charges that are looming, and it'll be very interesting to see how we do push back, given that the carbon border adjustment mechanism, just another green tariff barrier effectively that Europe has put up, is now receiving pushback from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. David Buckham, CEO of Monocle, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Fascinating to talk. Really enjoyed it.